The forgotten valley was not marked on any official map. Travelers said it shifted, as though the land itself refused to be found twice in the same place. When fog rolled down from the ridges of Appalachia, the valley disappeared entirely, swallowed by clouds that seemed to have memory, clouds that moved like ghosts remembering where they once died. Only the locals knew its name, though they spoke it quietly, as if sound itself could wake something ancient. To outsiders, it was nothing but another patch of wilderness. To those who had roots there, it was a wound that never healed. In the early 1800s, when the rest of America was charting new lands, digging for gold, and preaching about civilization, the valley stayed untouched. No church bell ever rang there. No courthouse was ever built. Yet smoke curled from its chimneys at dawn, and faint singing could be heard echoing between the hollows. The people who lived there, the Melungeons, were a mystery to anyone who came near. Their skin carried the memory of many continents, their features an unsettling blend of old worlds colliding. Some said they were the lost offspring of Portuguese sailors. Others swore they were the remnants of a vanished native tribe. And there were whispers, quieter still, that they came from neither, born instead of something far older, something not quite human. The few travelers who dared to pass through never stayed long. They returned with strange stories, of a place where night came faster, where shadows seemed thicker, and where eyes watched from behind the tree long after you thought you were alone. One man, a surveyor from Tennessee, told of hearing a low hum carried on the wind, a sound that followed him for miles, like chanting beneath the soil. Another swore he found a house with no doors, only windows that stared like hollow eyes into the forest. None could ever describe exactly how they got out. When asked, they would only say, "The mountain let me go." But the Melungeons didn't need the outside world, and the outside world didn't want them. They kept to themselves, building homes from dark oak and stone, trading among each other, raising their children beneath the watchful peaks. They spoke in a dialect no outsider could fully understand, a mix of tongues long dead. At night, their fires glowed red between the trees, and those who glimpsed them from afar said the light pulsed in rhythm, like a heartbeat. Sometimes, the smoke from their chimneys formed shapes that hung in the air too long, curling into what looked like faces. The valley was rich with stories passed down through whispers. The elders told of an ancient promise made before the first tree fell, a pact between men and mountain: as long as they lived in silence and never shed innocent blood, the land would protect them. It was said the earth itself answered their prayers, the wind bent around their homes, storms split in two before touching their fields, and animals wandered close to their fires without fear. But pacts are fragile things, especially those written in secrets. Strangers occasionally found the valley's edges, searching for work or land. Some were welcomed for a season, sharing bread and salt with the Melungeons, marveling at their strange hospitality. Yet something always drove them away. They spoke of the way laughter in the valley carried a second echo, as if two voices spoke at once. They noticed that mirrors didn't hang in the Melungeon homes, and that the people never crossed running water after sundown. One man said he saw a young girl standing at the creek, her reflection smiling a moment before she did. He left before morning. Even the forest itself seemed alive with intent. Trees grew too close together, their roots twisting like clenched fists. Birds didn't sing their past dusk. And every so often, an animal's carcass would be found perfectly intact, drained of blood but otherwise untouched. Locals muttered about old rites, blood offerings, and the whispers of the ancestors demanding payment for peace. Still, life went on. The Melungeons farmed their land, raised their children, and buried their dead beneath the same soil their ancestors had walked. They were a people apart, bound by silence and memory. But the world beyond the mountains was changing. Railroads, logging camps, and greedy hands began crawling into places they didn't belong. The valley became less of a myth and more of a mystery to exploit. A group of prospectors once tried to map the area, hoping to strike coal or gold. None of them were seen again. When a search party arrived weeks later, they found only their horses, tied neatly to a tree, untouched, unfed, their eyes wide open. No one spoke of it afterward, but word spread fast enough that the valley was left alone again. For a while. Every generation of Melungeons carried the same warning: never trust outsiders. Some of the elders said the mountains didn't like the scent of foreign blood. Others said it wasn't the mountains at all, it was what slept beneath them. Yet, there was a quiet sadness in their eyes when they spoke of it, as though they knew the world would one day come for them anyway. And when it did, the mountain would no longer protect, it would awaken. To the few who wandered near, the valley seemed frozen in time, neither alive nor dead. The air was too still, the silence too heavy, as if sound itself was afraid to linger. Moss covered the old fences, the paths wound like veins through the earth, and a strange sweetness hung in the air, the scent of decay and memory. At the center stood a massive oak tree, older than any house or grave, its bark carved with symbols no one could decipher. Beneath it, they said, the first Melungeon drew breath, and the first secret was buried. The forgotten valley had no name on any paper, no coordinates anyone could prove. But for those who felt it in their bones, who heard the whispers in the wind or saw the flicker of eyes behind the trees, it didn't need one. It was a place that remembered every voice, every betrayal, every drop of blood ever spilled upon its soil. And though the rest of the world might forget it, the valley never forgot the world. It began on a winter night when the wind carried the scent of smoke before the flames were even seen. The valley had always been a world apart, where the Melungeons lived in quiet defiance of time, their ways older than memory itself. But on that night, silence was broken by the echo of hooves and the laughter of men who had never belonged there. 18 outsiders rode into the valley with rifles and torches, claiming the land in the name of progress, of law, of a world that never once cared for the people who had built their lives in the shadows of those mountains. To the Melungeons, it was not progress that came riding down the ridge, it was hunger, cruelty, and greed dressed in boots and badges. They came just before midnight, when most families had gone to sleep. It began with the barking of dogs that suddenly fell silent, followed by the crack of a gun that ripped through the dark. Within minutes, fire bloomed in the hollows, painting the snow in orange and red. The outsiders went from cabin to cabin, kicking down doors, shouting accusations of witchcraft, of thievery, of harboring escaped slaves. None of it mattered. The truth was simpler, uglier, they wanted the land, the coal beneath it, and the silence of those who stood in their way. The Melungeons tried to reason, to plead, but reason is a language the cruel never learn. The first to die was an old man named Elias, known for his healing herbs and quiet songs. They dragged him from his home, demanding to know where he'd hidden his gold. When he told them he had none, they nailed his hands to his own door and set the house ablaze. His screams carried through the valley, echoing off the mountains like the cry of something more than human. By dawn, 17 more men were dead, brothers, fathers, sons, each slain in a different way, as though the killers took pleasure in inventing new methods of pain. When the sun rose, it revealed a landscape of ash and silence. The snow had turned gray, streaked with soot and blood. Women wept over charred beams and lifeless bodies. The children watched, their faces streaked with tears and smoke, too young to understand what they had lost, yet old enough to feel the hatred growing in their bones. They buried their dead beneath the oak tree at the center of the valley, the same tree their ancestors had sworn oaths under long ago. No preacher came, no hymn was sung. Only the wind spoke, whispering through the branches like a voice from the earth itself. That night, as the last of the fires smoldered, the surviving men and women gathered in a circle. The air was cold enough to burn their lungs, but no one shivered. They brought out a wooden bowl filled with river water and ash from the burned homes. One by one, they dipped their hands in it, marking their faces with streaks of black. It was not mourning, it was a vow. The eldest among them, a woman named Mara, stood and spoke words in the old tongue, a language that twisted like smoke and carried a weight that made even the fire crackle quieter. She named each of the 18 dead, then each of the killers. With every name spoken, she dropped a stone into the bowl, and the water darkened until it looked like blood. They called it the blood debt. It was not revenge in the way men of the outside world understood it. It was balance, a sacred exchange that had to be fulfilled for the valley to remain at peace. For every Melungeon life taken, one life would be reclaimed. No law of men could undo what had been done, so they turned to older laws, the ones written in roots and rivers, the ones the mountains themselves enforced. The children were told to remember the names. The women were told to keep the fire burning until the debt was paid. The men were told to become the shadow that followed the guilty. Over the weeks that followed, the valley began to change. Animals grew restless. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. Even the river, once clear, ran darker, as though carrying the memory of what it had witnessed. The outsiders never came back, at least, not all at once. But one by one, they began to disappear. The first was found hanging upside down from a pine tree just beyond the valley's edge, his eyes open, his tongue black. The second vanished entirely, leaving only his horse, circling the forest as if searching for its master. The third was discovered in a frozen creek, his skin pale as marble, his heart missing. Those who lived near the valley claimed to see figures moving through the fog, tall, silent shapes that carried no lanterns but seemed to glow faintly from within. Hunters swore they heard chanting in the woods at night, a low hum that made their blood run cold. The sheriff who led the raid was last. They found his body in a clearing weeks later, surrounded by 18 carved wooden tokens, each bearing the name of a murdered Melungeon. On his chest, burned into the flesh, was a single word, paid. The blood debt became legend, though no one outside the valley ever admitted to believing it. The few who dared to speak of it did so with trembling voices, glancing over their shoulders as if the shadows were listening. They said the Melungeons did not simply kill their enemies, they offered them. To whom, no one dared to ask. Some said the mountain demanded blood for blood, that it fed on betrayal and sorrow. Others believed the tribe's ancestors had risen to claim their vengeance personally, moving through the world unseen, carried by the mist itself. Generations later, the story was still told in whispers. Parents warned their children never to wander into the old valley, never to follow strange music through the trees, and never, ever, to speak the names of the dead aloud. Because in those mountains, names had power. And debts, once written in blood, were never forgotten. The night they took the oath, the valley was silent in a way it had never been before. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, listening. The fires from the slaughter still smoked in the hollows, the scent of burned wood and blood hanging thick in the cold air. The survivors gathered near the old creek where the water moved slow and black beneath the moonlight. There were no prayers, no tears left to shed. Grief had hardened into something sharper, something older than language. The children clung to their mothers, eyes wide with the kind of fear that makes you grow old too fast. The men stood motionless, their faces marked with soot and ash, the reflection of the flames dancing in eyes that no longer knew mercy. At the center of them all stood Mara, the same woman who had spoken the first words of the blood debt. She was older than anyone could remember, her hair white as frost, her voice low and steady. She carried a wooden bowl filled with creek water, darkened by the ashes of the burned homes. Around her feet were 18 stones, one for each life taken, smooth and round as if chosen by the river itself. The tribe formed a circle around her, hands joined, heads bowed not in worship but in defiance. When she spoke, the air seemed to shift. The words weren't English, nor any language the outside world would recognize. It was older, something that felt pulled from the roots of the earth, syllables that hummed like thunder trapped beneath the ground. The flames flickered as she spoke, bending toward her like they were listening too. She told them that blood had called to blood, and that the earth had answered. That justice belonged to those who remembered, and vengeance to those who refused to be forgotten. She told them the time for silence had ended, and that the mountain itself demanded their vow. They each stepped forward one by one, dipping their fingers into the bowl and marking their foreheads with the ashwater mixture. The cold liquid ran down their faces like tears that wouldn't dry. Each person whispered a name, one of the dead, or one of the killers, and dropped a small object into the fire, a piece of cloth, a coin, a splinter of wood. The flames hissed and spat, sending sparks spiraling upward like tiny souls clawing at the sky. When it was done, Mara spoke again, her voice rising above the wind. No law. No mercy. No God. Only the debt. The people repeated it, voices blending into a single sound that shook the trees. It wasn't a shout, it was a resonance, a vibration that seemed to echo from the soil itself. Birds burst from the treetops, and somewhere deep in the forest, something howled, a sound that didn't quite belong to any known creature. The water in the creek began to ripple, though no breeze touched its surface. The oath had been made, and the valley seemed to exhale, like a living thing accepting an ancient pact. From that night on, the Melungeons no longer looked the same. The light in their eyes dimmed, replaced by something colder, sharper. They spoke less, moved differently, as though listening for instructions from something unseen. The children were told never to cry for the dead again, because the dead were not gone, they were watching. The men began to carve symbols into trees and stones near their homes, strange markings meant to guide the spirits of their ancestors or ward off those who might betray the oath. No one crossed the creek without whispering a prayer first, and no one entered the woods alone. The outsiders who lived near the edge of the mountains began to notice strange things. Smoke rising from the valley though no one saw any fire. Drumming at night that came from nowhere and everywhere. Once, a trapper claimed he saw figures walking through the mist, their bodies solid but their faces obscured, each carrying something that looked like a lantern but glowed with no flame. He said they moved in single file, following the creek downstream, humming in low, mournful tones. When he tried to call out to them, they stopped all at once, turning toward him in perfect unison. He ran and never returned. For the Melungeons, the oath became more than vengeance, it became identity. Children grew up learning the words before they could even write their own names. The old songs changed, they carried a rhythm that mimicked the beating of the earth itself. Some claimed that the air near the creek grew colder after sundown, that whispers could be heard beneath the water, repeating the vow in voices that didn't belong to the living. Others said that, on certain nights, the reflection in the water wasn't your own, it was someone else's face, watching, waiting. The oath of shadows, as it came to be called, was never written down. It didn't need to be. It lived in the blood of the people who made it. And blood remembers. When one of the surviving families tried to leave the valley years later, tragedy followed them. Their crops failed, their cattle sickened, their children fell ill with fevers no doctor could name. The last survivor of that family returned to the valley and was found at dawn, lying beside the creek, his face marked with ash and water, the ancient words carved into the bark above his head. From then on, no one tried to leave again. The world outside continued to change, railroads crept closer, and towns grew near the edges of the mountains. But the valley remained untouched, unseen, as though hidden by something more than geography. Hunters, soldiers, and wanderers who strayed too far never found their way out the same. Some came back changed, quiet, pale, eyes wide like they'd seen something they couldn't speak of. A few never came back at all. The locals said it was the oath claiming what was owed, that every trespass was a reminder, every disappearance a whisper of the vow still alive in the soil. The Melungeons never spoke openly of that night by the creek, but the story lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. They carried it in their eyes, in the rhythm of their footsteps, in the silence that followed when someone asked about the past. The oath had bound them not just to vengeance but to the mountain itself, to its hunger and its memory. And though the world might forget their names, the earth would not. Because once a debt is written in blood, the shadow of that promise never fades, it only waits. The hunt began not with a shout or a gunshot, but with silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. After the oath was sworn by the creek, the Melungeons withdrew into their homes for 7 days. No one spoke above a whisper. The fires were kept low, and even the dogs were kept inside, as if the animals too understood what was about to happen. The air grew colder, heavier. Smoke from the chimneys hung low over the valley, refusing to rise. On the 7th night, when the moon was little more than a pale sliver in the sky, they gathered once more beneath the great oak at the center of the valley. The stones that marked the graves of the murdered men gleamed wet with frost, and the carved symbols on the tree's trunk seemed deeper, darker, as though freshly cut. Mara stood there again, holding a wooden box no larger than a loaf of bread. One by one, the people approached her. Each carried something small, a lock of hair, a drop of blood, a handful of dirt from the graves. They placed these offerings into the box in silence. When the last had stepped forward, Mara opened it and revealed 18 small tokens, carved roughly from the bones of animals. Each token bore a name, one for every man who had taken part in the massacre. The names were etched in the old tongue, written backward, so that no one but the earth itself could read them aloud without consequence. The tokens were passed around the circle, each person holding one before it was placed back into the box. When Mara closed the lid, the wind stirred for the first time that night, whispering through the bare branches like the valley itself exhaling. She spoke then, her voice barely above a murmur, telling them the time for mourning was over. The blood debt had been written, the oath had been bound, and now the mountain demanded payment. There would be no more waiting. For every name in the box, one of them would go into the world beyond the valley, find the men it belonged to, and bring back his silence. The next morning, before the frost had melted, the hunters left. They did not ride in a group. They left one by one, blending into the fog that clung to the ridges. Each carried a small pouch containing their token, a knife, and a handful of earth from the valley, so the mountain would never lose them, no matter how far they wandered. The women stayed behind, tending to the fires, whispering prayers into the smoke. The children were told to listen to the forest, for the forest would tell them when the first debt was paid. For weeks, nothing stirred. The valley was as still as a graveyard. But then the signs began to appear. One morning, a wooden token was found lying at the edge of the creek. It bore the first name, the men who had nailed Elias to his own door. The token was wet, streaked with something that wasn't water. The next day, word reached the neighboring towns. A man had been found dead just outside Kingsport, his body hanging upside down from a pine tree, eyes open and mouth filled with river mud. His tongue had been cut out and placed in his hand. The sheriff who found him said it looked like he had been trying to speak, even in death. Over the following months, the pattern continued. Each death was different, but each one carried the same message. A token bearing the victim's name was always found nearby, carved in the same crude hand, sometimes nailed to a tree, sometimes left on a windowsill. Fear began to crawl through the nearby settlements like a sickness. Men refused to travel alone, doors were barred at sundown, and preachers spoke of curses and demons stalking the mountains. But the Melungeons never spoke of it. Their valley remained quiet, untouched by the hysteria outside. And yet, those who wandered too close claimed to see strange fires burning on the ridges, moving in slow, deliberate circles. One hunter was found miles away from the valley, kneeling in the snow with his hands pressed together as if in prayer. His heart had been removed and placed neatly beside him, frozen solid. Another disappeared completely, leaving behind only his boots and a trail of footprints that stopped at the edge of a cliff. Some said the Melungeons had become beasts, shapeshifters who could melt into the mist and strike unseen. Others believed they were not acting alone, that the mountain itself hunted with them, guiding their hands and hiding their tracks. Those who had once called them savages now called them spirits. Inside the valley, the people marked each death by placing a new stone at the foot of the oak tree. Children were forbidden from touching them, told they were cold even in the summer heat. Mara kept the box of tokens locked inside her home, and with each name that vanished from it, the air around her grew colder. Some nights she was seen standing by the creek, whispering into the dark water as if speaking to someone below its surface. The women said she was feeding the spirits that carried the hunters home. By the time the 11th token was returned, the outsiders had begun to flee the region entirely. Farms were abandoned, mines left half-dug. The mountains became quiet again, too quiet. Travelers passing through claimed to hear drumming far off in the night, a slow heartbeat echoing from somewhere deep underground. And though no one ever saw the hunters return, their families awoke each time to find small bundles left on their doorsteps, wrapped in cloth, damp with dew, each containing a token that had been taken from the box, now returned, its name scratched out. The last of the 18 was the man who had led the raid. He was said to have fled north, changing his name, hiding in the cities. But there is no distance far enough when the mountain has marked you. One morning, years later, he was found in a boarding house room, sitting upright in his chair, eyes staring toward the window. On the table before him was a small wooden token, split cleanly in two. The word carved into it was simple, paid. After that, no more tokens were found. The killing stopped, and the valley grew still again, the fog settling like a shroud. But those who lived nearby swore that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and red, the creek still ran dark, as if remembering. They said the hunters never came back because they had become something else, shadows that moved with the mist, keepers of a debt that could never truly be paid. And somewhere beneath the earth, the old box still waits, its lid sealed shut, the last of its power sleeping until the mountain decides to wake it again. By the time the last of the killers had fallen, the valley no longer felt like part of the world. The air itself seemed heavier, as if weighed down by what had been done. The hunt had ended, but the echoes of it remained in everything, the way the trees leaned inward, the stillness of the water, the silence that hung like fog. Word spread quickly through the surrounding settlements, traveling faster than any wagon or horse could carry it. People spoke of the valley in hushed tones, calling it cursed, haunted, poisoned by its own sorrow. None of them dared to go near it. The few who had once traded with the Melungeons stopped coming entirely, claiming they could hear cries on the wind, or see shapes moving in the mist that were too tall, too still to be human. The nearby towns began to empty out one by one. The fear didn't come all at once, it crept slowly, like a sickness. It started with whispers among miners and woodcutters who worked near the ridges. They said their tools went missing overnight, that campfires would be found cold in the morning though no rain had fallen. A hunter claimed he followed a deer into the woods only to find a clearing filled with stones arranged in a circle, each one carved with strange symbols. Another said he heard laughter in the trees, soft at first, then rising until it sounded like the shrieking of birds. When he turned back, he swore the path behind him was gone. As the stories multiplied, families began to pack their belongings without waiting for proof. The church bells stopped ringing. The schoolhouse doors were nailed shut. Men who once mocked the tales refused to go outside after dark. Those who stayed behind started marking their doors with crosses made from twigs, and women burned sage and salt in their windows, hoping to keep the valley's ghosts at bay. But it didn't matter. Fear had already settled into their bones. And yet, there were some who didn't believe. Prospectors, soldiers, and the curious few came, drawn by the mystery. They said the Melungeons were just hill people with strange customs, that all this talk of spirits and vengeance was superstition. They wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the tree line. None of them came back the same. Those who returned spoke little, eyes sunken and voices hollow. One man muttered endlessly about the faces in the smoke. Another refused to sleep indoors ever again, saying the shadows in the walls whispered to him. A young surveyor was found wandering barefoot along the river, clothes torn, muttering that the woods were watching him breathe. Soon the settlements nearest the valley were abandoned altogether. Nature began to reclaim them, vines growing over the church doors, grass pushing through cracks in the roads, roofs collapsing under the weight of rain and time. It was as though the land wanted to erase every trace of those who had trespassed. The few who passed through years later found entire homesteads standing empty, meals still laid out on tables turned to dust, a chair still rocking slowly by the fireplace. It looked less like people had left and more like they had simply vanished. The animals changed too. Birds avoided the skies above the valley. Deer would stop suddenly at its edge, stamping their hooves and turning back. Even the wolves, bold and hungry, circled wide around it. Hunters from neighboring counties noticed their dogs refusing to cross certain trails, tails tucked, eyes wide with unseen terror. It was as if the entire forest remembered what had happened there and wanted no part of it. The nights grew longer, the mists thicker. Travelers passing through the mountains sometimes caught sight of faint lights flickering between the trees, moving in slow, deliberate patterns like lanterns carried by invisible hands. There was a story told by an old trapper years later, a man named Crowley, who claimed he dared to walk through the edge of the valley one autumn evening when the fog was low. He said he found an old cabin, half collapsed, the door swinging open in the wind. Inside, dust lay thick on everything, yet the fireplace was warm and glowing faintly with red embers, though no wood burned. On the mantel above it rested a small carving of a hand, fingers pointing upward, as if warning him to leave. He did. When he returned to his camp miles away, he found a wooden token lying beside his fire, marked with a single word, remember. As the decades passed, the valley faded from maps. Cartographers who tried to chart the region found their instruments malfunctioning. Compasses spun aimlessly, and measurements never added up. One survey team claimed the terrain shifted while they worked, streams they'd crossed hours before were gone, ridges appeared where flat land had been. Eventually, they abandoned their efforts altogether. The valley became known as the hollow that moves. Locals said it wasn't that the land itself shifted, but that it chose who could find it. Those the mountain didn't want were turned around, lost, sent home with memories that didn't fit together. Those it did want were never seen again. By the turn of the century, stories of the Melungeons had become legend. Parents used them to scare their children into obedience, warning that the spirits of the lost tribe still hunted those who wronged them. Preachers called it a lesson from God, proof that sin carried its own punishment. But there were a few who spoke differently. They said the Melungeons hadn't vanished at all. They had simply retreated deeper into the mountains, where the mist never lifted, where the world of the living and the dead blurred together. Some claimed they'd seen figures at dusk, tall, thin, their skin pale as moonlight, watching from the tree-line. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But their eyes burned with a light that wasn't natural. The last settler to leave the area was an old woman named Esther Lane. Before she left, she wrote a letter to her son in Knoxville. In it, she said she could hear singing every night, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the valley. The songs weren't in English. They were in a tongue she didn't recognize, soft and sorrowful, rising and falling like waves. She said it sounded like mourning, but also like a promise. Her final words in the letter were simple: "The mountain remembers." After that, no one spoke of the valley again. It was left to the trees and the mist, to the silence and the ghosts. The Melungeons had vanished from the eyes of men, but the land that had birthed them, that had held their blood and their pain, remained alive with their memory. Those who passed near it said the air grew cold, the forest grew quiet, and the feeling of being watched followed them long after they left the mountains behind. The Black Book of Kingsport surfaced decades after the last whisper of the Melungeon Valley had faded into rumor. It appeared without warning, found in the dusty backroom of a trading post that had long since stopped serving customers. The store belonged to a man named Robert Tinsley, who had inherited it from his grandfather. One stormy night, while sorting through a pile of rotting crates and forgotten ledgers, Tinsley stumbled upon a wooden chest sealed with wax so old it crumbled at his touch. Inside was a bundle of rags wrapped around something heavy. When he peeled away the fabric, a faint smell of earth and ash filled the room. What he held was a book, thick, bound in blackened leather, its edges scorched, as though it had survived a fire long ago. There was no title on the cover, no author's name, only a single symbol pressed into the leather, a spiral coiled inward like an eye. The pages inside were yellow and brittle, the ink faded but still legible in places. The writing was strange, uneven, as though done by many hands over many years. The first few entries appeared to be ordinary records, lists of names, dates, places. But as Tinsley turned the pages, the words began to shift. Some were in English, others in languages he didn't recognize, written in symbols that looked more carved than written. And then there were the numbers. 18 of them, each marked beside a name, each name struck through with a dark line. Some pages bore drawings, rough sketches of faces, maps of valleys, circles of stones, and shapes that looked almost human but not quite. The further he read, the more the air in the room seemed to change. He could swear the scent of wet earth grew stronger, that the walls of the trading post seemed to pulse with an invisible heartbeat. On one page, there was a sentence written in neat, careful handwriting that chilled him to the bone: asterisk, those who owe blood are counted. Those who pay are erased. Asterisk beneath it, faintly etched into the paper, were 18 small symbols that matched the carvings found on old trees near the Appalachian ridges, symbols the locals said belonged to the lost tribe. Tinsley showed the book to the town preacher, hoping for an explanation. The preacher, Reverend Cole, was an old man, skeptical of ghost stories but devout in his belief that evil could take many forms. He spent hours poring over the pages by candlelight, muttering to himself as he traced the unfamiliar words. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. He said the book wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. A record of deaths, kept meticulously by hands that didn't age. Each name, he said, corresponded to a man who had vanished or been found dead after the massacre in the Melungeon Valley. 18 in total. And beneath those names were others, newer ones, written in a different hand, names that no one recognized. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Scholars from the nearest cities came to see it, claiming it was an artifact of immense anthropological value. They took photographs, made copies of the pages, but none could fully translate the language. Some said it was an old Portuguese dialect, others thought it was a blend of African, Cherokee, and Romani, but the truth didn't fit neatly into any category. There were words that seemed to shift meaning depending on who read them, sentences that rearranged themselves when copied. One linguist described it as a language that refuses to be known. Then the accidents began. The first scholar to take the book back to his university in Virginia fell ill within a week. He complained of hearing whispering voices in his office, of feeling watched even when he was alone. He was found dead in his study one morning, slumped over his desk, the open pages of the book before him. His eyes were open, and on the wall behind him was a single word written in his own hand: counted. The university sealed his office, and the book was quietly returned to Kingsport. No one argued. The people of Kingsport began to treat the book like a curse. They said at night, if you stood near the trading post where it was kept, you could hear faint scratching sounds, like someone turning its pages from inside the chest. The new preacher ordered it burned, but when they tried, the fire refused to take. The pages blackened but did not crumble, the ink seemed to glow faintly red, and the flames turned cold. They buried it instead, deep beneath the floorboards of the church, sealed with salt and iron. Years later, during renovations, the book was found again. It looked untouched by time. The leather still black, the pages still brittle but whole. A carpenter who handled it claimed he saw his own name faintly written in the margins, though when he showed it to others, the name had vanished. He quit his work that same day, moved out of Kingsport, and never returned. The new pastor ordered the book locked in the church vault, but some nights, parishioners swore they could hear the sound of turning pages echoing through the sanctuary. The book became known as the Black Book of Kingsport, a name whispered by those who remembered the old stories of the Melungeons. Some said it had been written by Mara herself, the woman who led the oath by the creek. Others claimed it was older than even the valley, a relic passed down through generations of watchers, each adding names to the list when debts were owed. A few believed it wasn't written by human hands at all. The handwriting changed too often, the ink too dark, the words too alive. One winter, the church caught fire during a lightning storm. The vault melted, the pews turned to ash, the walls collapsed. But when dawn came and the smoke cleared, the book was found lying untouched in the ruins, open to a page that no one had seen before. On it was written a new list of names, none of them from the 1800s, all of them belonging to people who lived in Kingsport that very year. No one dared to read them aloud. The book was taken away again, this time sealed in a glass case at the local museum. But visitors who stood too close said they could see faint impressions appearing on the blank pages, like invisible hands writing slowly, patiently, waiting for someone to notice. The curator who oversaw the exhibit disappeared 3 weeks later. When his office was searched, the only thing left on his desk was a small wooden token, carved with a spiral and a single word burned into the grain. The word was, "Remember." And though the museum staff swore they had locked the book away, it was gone the next morning, the glass shattered, the case empty, the smell of earth and ash lingering in the air. The first disappearance after the Black Book returned to the valley happened on a night when the fog came down thick as wool, swallowing the mountains whole. It was 1912, and the people of Kingsport were trying hard to forget the old stories, to bury the whispers of curses and oaths beneath the noise of progress. The railway had finally reached the outskirts of town, and new faces had come with it, merchants, miners, preachers, men with hard hands and harder hearts. But the fog, as the old ones said, carried memory, and at night it moved like something alive, curling around the houses and creeping through the trees with purpose. The first man to vanish was a drifter named Eli Ward, a newcomer with no ties and no faith in ghost tales. He had been boasting earlier that evening in the saloon, laughing at the old mountain folks who still locked their doors and hung charms of iron over their windows. "Ain't no dead men walking these woods," he said, slamming his whiskey down and daring the night to prove him wrong. He left before midnight, taking the narrow trail through the hollow that led toward the old Melungeon Creek. The barkeep saw him go and swore later that the fog followed him, thickening around his boots like smoke. By morning, he was gone. They found his hat near the water's edge, soaked and torn, but no sign of him, no footprints, no blood, no struggle. Just the fog, still clinging to the trees long after the sun should have burned it away. The sheriff organized a search party, men with lanterns and dogs, but the animals refused to go near the creek. They whined and pulled against their leashes, ears pinned back, tails tucked low. One man said he heard humming, faint and low, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. They left before nightfall. The second disappearance came a week later, and then a third. Each person was last seen walking near the same stretch of woods where the Melungeons were said to have taken their oath. Panic began to spread quietly, hidden beneath polite smiles and forced laughter. People started nailing their windows shut, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. The preacher refused to mention the book, but everyone knew it had something to do with what was happening. Someone claimed they saw the same spiral symbol carved into a tree near the last disappearance site, the lines still fresh, sap bleeding from the bark like an open wound. The night of the town meeting was when the terror took its truest shape. The mayor insisted it was all superstition, that the missing had simply run off or met with an animal. But midway through his speech, the oil lamps flickered, and the room grew cold. The flames steadied again, but something had changed. On the wall behind the mayor, black soot marks had appeared, 18 of them, arranged in a perfect circle. No one spoke. The preacher crossed himself. The mayor swore it was a trick of the light, but the next morning, he too was gone. His wife found the bed empty, the sheets undisturbed, and a single word scrawled on the mirror in the same black soot, "Counted." Fear turned the town inside out. Men formed patrols, rifles in hand, though none of them could say what they were hunting. Women began burning sage and hanging sprigs of rosemary above their doors. The old folks who remembered the Melungeons warned the young not to go near the creek, not to look into the water after dark, because it showed you what was coming for you. The younger men mocked them at first, until one of them came back from the woods at dawn, pale and trembling, unable to speak for 3 days. When he finally did, his voice was cracked and hollow. All he said was, "They're counting again." As the fog returned each night, people began hearing things, low voices calling their names from the treeline, whispers in the walls of their homes. A farmer's wife claimed she saw figures standing in the field behind her house at dusk, motionless, their faces hidden by the mist. When she blinked, they were gone, but in the dirt she found 18 footprints, pressed deep into the soil. Others reported strange lights drifting through the trees, glowing with a color no one could name, flickering like lanterns carried by unseen hands. The local constable tried to leave town with his family, but the bridge leading out had collapsed overnight, as though something had ripped it from below. His horse refused to cross the remaining planks. They turned back, and that same night, his youngest daughter vanished from her bed. The window was locked, the door unopened, and yet her small footprints led out into the fog and disappeared near the old creek. When they searched, they found her doll sitting on the bank, its face smeared with ash. By the 3rd month, Kingsport had changed. No one stayed outside after dark, and the town bell rang every evening at sunset, a ritual warning to keep to the light. The preacher led nightly prayers in the church, but the air inside grew heavier each time, as if something unseen was listening from the rafters. Once, during a service, a child began to laugh uncontrollably, pointing at something no one else could see. When she finally stopped, she whispered, "They're here now." The next morning, her family's house burned to the ground. No one saw her again. Rumors spread that the Melungeons had returned, or their spirits had risen to finish what began a century before. Others said it was the oath itself, alive and feeding, collecting what was owed. The fog became their sign, a curtain drawn between the living and the remembered. Old journals found in town later described nights when the fog would part just enough to reveal shapes, tall, thin figures walking in a line, their heads bowed, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Those who claimed to have seen them never agreed on the details, but all mentioned the same sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping, like stones being counted. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the disappearances stopped. The fog lifted, the air cleared, and the creek ran quiet again. Life in Kingsport resumed, though no one truly believed it was over. A few months later, a traveling merchant passed through the valley and stopped at the church to rest. He noticed something strange carved into the wood of the pews, names, dozens of them, freshly etched. 18 stood out, marked with a spiral beside each. When he asked who they were, no one answered. The preacher only told him to keep moving, to never speak of it again. And yet, every year since then, when the fog returns to the valley and the church bell tolls at dusk, someone swears they can hear it, the faint sound of stones clicking together, one for each soul taken, one for each debt paid. When the first winter snow fell over the valley after the disappearances, it covered the land like a shroud, quieting the last whispers of the missing. But beneath that stillness, something lingered. The people of Kingsport had begun to move on, or at least pretend to. They spoke less of the fog and the vanished souls, and more of harvests and railroads and the price of coal. Yet, even as they tried to rebuild, small things began to shift. The air carried a strange chill that had nothing to do with the season, and at night, when the wind passed through the trees, it seemed to hum like a low chant. The old folks said the mountain was speaking again. The young dismissed it as nonsense, though they kept to the light all the same. It began with the dreams. Men and women throughout the valley started waking in the middle of the night, hearts pounding, the sound of dripping water echoing in their ears. Some said they saw faces in the dark, familiar but wrong. One woman claimed she dreamed of standing at the edge of the old creek, watching the frozen water split open, and hands, gray and thin, reaching out. Each morning, her window was found slightly open, though she swore she locked it before bed. The blacksmith's son started carving symbols into his bedpost without realizing it, the same spirals and marks that had been found near the massacre site a century ago. He didn't remember doing it, only that something whispered in his ear while he slept, telling him to remember the names. Then the children began to hum. Not a song anyone recognized, but a slow, droning melody that sent chills down the spine. They would hum it in school, in church, in their sleep. Their eyes would glaze over as if listening to something only they could hear. One evening, during a Sunday service, a little girl began humming it so loudly that the rest of the congregation fell silent. The candles flickered and the air grew cold. When the preacher tried to quiet her, she looked up at him and said, in a voice not her own, "You've forgotten the 18th." No one asked what she meant, but every adult in that room knew there were supposed to be 18 names in the book. The implication that one had been missed hung heavy in the air. A week later, the river thawed earlier than usual, though the temperature remained freezing. The ice cracked with a sound that echoed through the valley, and from that night on, the creek's water ran black. Fishermen who went to the river refused to speak of what they saw beneath the surface, only that the reflection of the moon seemed wrong, too large, too close, as if staring back. When the miller tried to draw water for his grindstone, he found his bucket filled with something thick and dark that smelled faintly of iron. The next morning, his wife found him sitting on the bank, his boots off, his feet submerged in the freezing current. He was whispering something over and over again. The count was never finished. The dreams grew worse. People started seeing the same figure, a woman in tattered clothes, her face pale as ash, eyes black as the creek water. Some said she wore a crown of woven thorns, others said her hair hung wet over her face. But all agreed on one thing: she always spoke the same words, "You swore in blood." The name Mara began to circulate again, spoken in whispers, though no one had uttered it aloud in generations. Those who dared to say it claimed the wind changed direction when they did, as if the mountains themselves were listening. One night, the church bell began to toll on its own. The ropes were untouched, but the sound echoed through the valley in slow, deliberate intervals, 18 times. When the townsfolk gathered the next morning, they found footprints in the snow outside the church, leading from the forest to the door. They stopped abruptly at the steps, as though whoever left them had vanished into thin air. The preacher insisted it was a prank, but his voice trembled. That same night, he disappeared. His Bible was found open on the pulpit, the ink from his notes smeared into an unrecognizable spiral. After that, the people began leaving. Families packed their belongings and fled before sunset, abandoning homes that had stood for generations. But the further they went from the valley, the stranger things became. Horses refused to cross certain bridges. Compass needles spun wildly. Those who made it to neighboring towns found themselves waking up in the middle of the night with mud on their feet, though they hadn't left their beds. A merchant who had fled to Tennessee claimed he woke to find his door open and the sound of distant drumming, faint but unmistakable, coming from the mountains he had left behind. For those who stayed, time began to warp. Days felt shorter, nights longer. The sky took on a strange hue at dusk, the clouds bleeding into deep reds and violets that seemed unnatural. Animals avoided the area, and the birds that once filled the trees went silent. Hunters reported seeing figures moving between the trees, always just out of sight, too tall, too still. Once, a group of men followed one of these shapes deep into the forest. Only one returned, his hair turned white, his eyes unfocused. When asked what he saw, he said, "They're not gone. They're waiting for the name that was forgotten." Then the fog returned, thicker and darker than before. It rolled through the streets and fields, swallowing everything in its path. Those who walked into it swore they heard voices whispering their names, asking questions they couldn't understand. Some saw the creek glowing faintly beneath the fog, its surface rippling with movement though no wind stirred the air. And in the distance, they said, a figure stood watching, still, silent, holding the black book against her chest. By the time the sun rose the next morning, half the town was gone. Doors were left open, fires still burning in stoves, food half-eaten on tables. There were no signs of struggle, just absence, as if the valley had quietly reclaimed what it was owed. Those who came searching from nearby towns found the place empty, the snow unbroken except for a trail of 18 footprints leading toward the creek. They followed the tracks until they simply stopped at the water's edge. The surface was calm, glassy, reflecting the sky perfectly. But beneath it, some swore they saw movement, shadows shifting, faces turning upward. No one dared to stay after that. Kingsport was abandoned, left to rot under the weight of its own silence. Over time, the forest grew over the roads, the houses collapsed, and the creek returned to its usual murky calm. But on certain nights, when the fog rises and the wind hums through the trees, travelers claim they can still see faint lights moving through the valley, lanterns without flames, carried by figures who do not cast shadows. And if you listen closely, beneath the sound of the water, you can hear the whisper of turning pages, as though the dead is still being recorded, one name at a time. Years passed before anyone dared to step into the ruins of Kingsport again. Nature had reclaimed what it could, roots split through cabin floors, vines crawled up church walls, and the air smelled of damp moss and decay. What was once a living town had become a ghost memory, fading beneath layers of time and silence. Travelers who passed along the old road said that even birds refused to sing when they neared the valley, that the world seemed to hold its breath the moment they crossed into its shadow. But still, people are drawn to the places that frighten them, and by the early 1930s, a group of men from Charleston came seeking the truth. They were researchers, or so they claimed, sent by a university to study Appalachian folklore. The locals warned them not to go, muttering about debts unpaid and oaths unbroken, but curiosity has always been a kind of curse, and these men were not the first to mistake legend for superstition. They arrived at the edge of the valley just before dusk. The trees stood taller than they remembered from the maps, their branches woven so thick they almost blocked out the sky. The ground was soft and damp, as if the earth had never dried after a long rain. The men, 6 in all, set up camp near the remnants of the old church, though one of them, a quiet fellow named Harlan, refused to sleep inside. He said the walls whispered when the wind passed through the cracks, that if you listened long enough, you could hear voices counting in a low murmur. The others laughed it off, opening their whiskey and making notes about the strange carvings still visible in the pews, spirals, crosses, and symbols that no one recognized. They didn't see the faint footprints in the dust, smaller than a man's, circling the altar. That night, the fog returned, moving low and slow across the ground. Harlan woke to the sound of water dripping. When he looked outside his tent, the air shimmered with a faint silver light. The others were still asleep, but he saw movement near the church, figures, thin and pale, gliding between the gravestones. Their faces were indistinct, their clothes soaked as if they had risen straight from the creek. He called out to them, thinking it might be locals playing a trick, but the figures turned in unison, their heads snapping toward him with unnatural precision. Harlan fell backward, the sound of whispers filling his ears, not in English but in a rhythm that felt like breathing. When the fog thickened, he could barely see his own hands. He stumbled toward the fire, calling for the others. But when he reached the camp, only 3 of the 6 men remained. They searched until dawn, finding no sign of the missing 2, no tracks, no torn fabric, nothing. Only the faint sound of the creek running black beneath the frost. The leader of the group, Professor Laird, tried to keep the team focused. He told them stories of hysteria and imagination, that the mind could conjure horrors when surrounded by too much silence. But that morning, he noticed something that made his words hollow. On the door of the church, freshly carved into the rotting wood, were 2 new spirals, each marked beside a name. The names were their own. Laird wanted to leave immediately, but the road back was gone. Overnight, the trail had been swallowed by the forest. Trees that hadn't been there before now blocked their way, roots coiled like serpents across the ground. Compasses spun aimlessly. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the valley itself was closing around them. They decided to follow the creek instead, reasoning that water always led out. But as they walked, the landscape seemed to twist upon itself. They passed the same trees again and again, the same fallen log, the same stretch of moss-covered stones. Every time they stopped to rest, the silence deepened until it felt alive. Then came the smell, earthy, metallic, the scent of rusted iron and old blood. On the 3rd night, one of the men woke screaming. The others rushed to his tent, finding him shaking, pointing toward the creek. "They're counting again," he said over and over. "They're missing 1." When morning came, he was gone, leaving only his boots behind. Laird's journal, found decades later, contained a final entry written in a trembling hand, *, there are 18. Always 18. But one remains unseen, and it waits for the one who speaks its name. *. The survivors stumbled out of the valley a week later, delirious and frostbitten. They had no memory of how they escaped, only that they awoke on the outskirts of town, lying in the road beneath a gray sky. They were found by a passing farmer who said the men reeked of swamp water and smoke. One of them clutched something wrapped in cloth, a torn piece of the church door, still marked with the spirals. Laird died 2 months later, muttering in his sleep about a woman with black eyes standing in the fog. The others never spoke publicly about what they'd seen, though one of them reportedly went blind overnight and spent the rest of his life sketching spirals onto the walls of his home. Years later, a local historian tracked down the remnants of their expedition. The university had no record of funding such a trip. No permits, no correspondence, no mention of the 6 men at all. As if they had never existed. The historian found the journal in an old chest, waterlogged and half-rotted, the ink faded to brown. Among its pages was a single pressed leaf, brittle but intact, stained with a dark, circular mark. On the last page, beneath Laird's handwriting, was another line written in a different hand, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably old. Asterisk, the count continues. Asterisk. After that, the valley was avoided entirely. Maps stopped marking it. The forest grew thicker, and travelers who strayed too close reported strange sounds at night, distant counting, rhythmic tapping, and sometimes laughter that didn't echo quite right. They said the fog there moved differently, as if guided by invisible hands, and that when it touched you, it left behind the faint scent of ash and river water. A few locals believed the valley itself was alive, fed by oaths, memory, and fear. Others said the Melungeons had never left at all, only learned how to live in the space between death and remembrance. The Black Book was never recovered. Some say it lies buried beneath the creek bed, its pages still turning in the dark, adding new names to the ledger as time moves forward. Others say it travels, appearing wherever old debts remain unpaid. What's certain is that no one who entered the valley ever came back unchanged. And on foggy nights, when the wind moves through the hollows of the Appalachians, it carries with it a sound that doesn't belong to the living, the steady rhythm of voices counting, soft and low, as though keeping track of something that has no end. The last trace of the Melungeon curse, if that's what it was, revealed itself not in blood or fog but in the quiet hum of electricity. By the mid-20th century, Kingsport had become nothing more than a ghost story told by coal miners and wanderers who camped too close to the ridge. The old maps no longer marked the valley, and most of those who remembered it were long dead or too afraid to speak of it. But in 1953, a team of state surveyors arrived in the Appalachian foothills to assess land for a new highway. Their work was ordinary, mechanical, and precise, until one of them noticed that the valley didn't appear where it should. On every chart, there was a blank space, a perfect oval of unmarked terrain surrounded by trees. It wasn't listed as protected land or private property, it simply didn't exist. Yet when they stood on the ridge overlooking it, they could see the faint outline of a depression in the forest below, as though something enormous had once been there and had slowly sunk into the earth. The lead surveyor, a man named Briggs, insisted they descend. The others hesitated. The forest grew unnaturally still the closer they came to the rim, as if the usual sounds of wind and birds had been swallowed. The deeper they went, the more the air thickened. Radio signals cut out. Their compasses spun without direction. One man complained that the static in his headset sounded like whispering, another swore he heard footsteps matching their own from behind. When they finally reached the valley floor, it was as though the world had changed color. The light dimmed to a pale, silver gray. The ground beneath their boots was soft and damp, and there was a faint hum, low, constant, like the vibration of an unseen machine. They found remnants of structures, crumbling foundations, the frame of a church door half buried in soil, shards of glass from windows that hadn't been touched in decades. But what unsettled them most were the carvings. Spirals, dozens of them, etched into stone and tree bark, forming lines that seemed to connect from one to another, as though marking a pattern only visible from above. Briggs ordered photographs, but the film later developed blank. The only image that survived was one accidental shot, a blurred photograph taken when one of the men dropped his camera. It showed a faint outline of a figure standing in the fog, too far away to be clear, but its shape unmistakably human. That night, they made camp on the ridge. One of the men, Carter, claimed he saw lights moving in the valley below, small orbs that glowed white and moved in a slow, deliberate circle. Briggs dismissed it as gas or fireflies, though he didn't sleep. By morning, Carter was gone. His sleeping bag lay open, his boots still beside it, his radio crackling with static that almost sounded like counting. Briggs left 2 men behind to search while he hiked out for help, but when he returned 3 days later with state police, the camp was empty. The tents were torn, the supplies scattered, and in the dirt where the fire had been, someone had drawn a spiral large enough to stand inside. 18 stones surrounded it. The report filed by Briggs was brief, clinical, and incomplete. He wrote of disorientation, compass failure, missing personnel, and environmental anomalies. The file was quietly sealed, stamped with a government insignia, and stored away. Briggs left the survey project shortly afterward, moving west and changing his name. But in a recorded interview years later, he admitted that something followed him out of that valley. He said he could feel it even in cities, in rooms full of people, in the moments before sleep when silence settled. He described hearing a faint tapping sound whenever he closed his eyes, like pebbles hitting glass. Before the tape cut off, he whispered, it never stopped counting. The valley became off-limits soon after, fenced off under the guise of geological instability. Rumors spread that the military had taken interest, that strange equipment had been brought in at night, radar devices, seismic readers, things that hummed faintly like the sound the surveyors described. Workers who went to install fencing reported odd disturbances, tools missing, machines stalling, and at least one man claiming he saw his own reflection blink before he did. They said the ground vibrated gently under their feet, as if something deep below the surface was breathing. By the late 1970s, the area was erased from public records. Satellite images of that section of Appalachia showed nothing but an expanse of forest, untouched and symmetrical. Yet hikers who strayed too close began reporting strange occurrences, voices calling their names, static in their radios, sudden fog even on clear days. A few spoke of lights forming patterns in the sky above the valley, moving in rhythmic pulses, 18 in total before vanishing. Those who tried to photograph them found their cameras malfunctioning, their film scorched as though burned from within. In 1991, a journalist named Evelyn Parr, known for her investigations into forgotten American myths, decided to find the valley herself. She spent 6 months researching the Melungeon legends, tracing every version of the story from oral history to court documents. She discovered that Kingsport had once existed but was erased from census records around 1914. When she found mention of the Black Book of Kingsport in a library catalogue from 1899, the record disappeared the next day. Undeterred, she drove into the mountains alone, leaving her colleagues a note that simply read, "If the count is real, I'll find it." Her car was discovered 3 days later on an old logging road, the keys still in the ignition, headlights dim. The tires were covered in mud, though there had been no rain. Inside the glove compartment was her field recorder. The final minute of the last tape captured the sound of heavy breathing, followed by a faint whisper that repeated her name 3 times. Then came the same steady rhythm heard in every story before hers, the sound of stones clinking together, deliberate and slow. No body was ever found. Today, the valley remains absent from maps, and the locals who live near its invisible borders refuse to talk about it. Some say that on certain nights, when the fog rolls low and the moon hangs heavy, the hum returns, faint but constant, like the beating of a buried heart. The old tellers of the story say the count was never meant to end, that the oath of the Melungeons was written not on paper, but into the soil itself, feeding on memory and trespass alike. Travelers who camped too close claimed to see pale figures standing at the tree line, unmoving, their faces lost to shadow. A few hear a woman's voice whispering from the dark creek bed, asking a single question that freezes them where they stand: who will be the 19th?